Test, test. Hello? Hello? Everybody can hear me, right? Yes? Yep, okay. That's okay. Hi. Thank you for turning out. I know it's the end of a long conference. The organizers of mHealth had asked us as part of the pavilion that we were doing if we wanted to do anything else. We said we always love the chance to speak and have a forum, especially at events like this, to do almost something that kind of devolves into an extended Q&A. So feel free to ask questions. We're going to do some sort of landscape overview. I'm going to give a basic talk of what we're doing on the Games for Health project, as well as sort of provide a little bit of observation as to where I see the space at right now. And then we have Ellen Lapointe from Hope Lab, who's going to talk about two particular projects that they've done, but in the process of doing that, I think exemplify sort of not only where the space has been, but some of the areas it's moving into and some of the thoughts behind some of the people who have been operating in the Games for Health field for a while and how they're evolving. And then we have a couple of other sessions on the agenda, again, designed to provide a few highlights and then spur conversation. So I'll start off. This is sort of the basic promise that we have for Games for Health, and it's really important to understand that what we're trying to do with the Games for Health project is really look at where there may be comparative advantages for what video games and video game technologies have to offer. And really understand whether it's around engagement and motivation, systems that can support and instigate change, behavior change or otherwise, and the ability to use games, especially electronic games, that can rest upon computer networks, pervasive devices like the kinds of platforms that we're spent talking about all week here, to really scale these kinds of interventions, to scale these kinds of educational opportunities, and then sustain people's involvement in them long enough to give them a meaningful experience and ideally a meaningful outcome and utility from that. What we're finding with games also is part of it is about this notion of an active communication medium, and that as a result of that you are potentially seeking from a comparative advantage better results than, say, other forms of media-based behavior change. And ultimately are inherently about decisions. And when we talk about healthcare and the decisions related to it, I mean, games are a perfect medium to explore that kind of idea, how choices lead to different outcomes, how they lead to longitudinal outcomes, the frequency and the sort of scenario-driven decision-making that may happen and the underlying patterns of decisions. So we think that games have some natural affinity for these things, and we're spending our time exploring those. And then from that, we can start to sort of even elaborate on what these might be or what might be the kinds of components of games, the types of things that we're doing in games that feed into these mechanisms of why I start something, why I enjoy playing it, and why I keep playing it, and the underlying content and processes and behaviors that may be attached to those applications. One of the things that we did early on was look at a wide taxonomy of opportunities for games in healthcare. And at any one of our events, even at the pavilion downstairs this week, it's really interesting to see the spectrum and the breadth that games are playing in health and healthcare, either on a potential basis or on actual work. And at our conference, our annual conference held in the spring, summer each year, about 2/3 of these boxes are usually on display. And what this says to me is that Games for Health is not just a particular one-off opportunity, a particular problem you might chase once with a game, try something new, but that it actually represents a strategic opportunity for all kinds of organizations and enterprises. And that as a strategic opportunity, at whatever level of investment, it should be a sustained level investment, even if that investment is about assigning people and time to keep an eye on a market to keep developing prototypes or to bring in experts to talk, to look for partnerships. That this is really starting to emerge the way we thought about social media and the web, moved from sort of a one-off experiment within a particular unit to being a strategic investment that touches all aspects of an enterprise. Here's just a screenshot of a variety of games, some of which are on display downstairs this week. And really, without going into the details of what's up there, there are just a variety of applications in different touch points, whether it be mental health, cancer, HIV, obesity, diabetes, smoking, even crowdsourcing for drug discovery. But everything on that screen, I think, is produced at a certain level that at least immediately at first glance, you know, judging the book by its cover, it looks like something you want to engage in. It looks like something that's interesting, that there's something going on the screen that you want to take part in and at least explore. And that good games have that sort of production value, that pick-me-up and play production value. That ultimately, if the rest of the game is designed as well as, say, a screenshot might foretell, you're down that rabbit hole. You know, and compare that to, say, a typical desktop application, which does none of that, or even some of, you know, some of the early apps that we see in health or in other spaces that, you know, look like long lists of tables and boxes to fill out. This is our annual conference. The next one will be this June, and we have days devoted to mobile health, exercise. We're doing global health this year, corporate wellness. And we have a variety of researchers, game developers, health professionals coming together and creating an interdisciplinary space through which we've actually seen a number of projects actually launch out of the conference just by getting people together, sharing insights and enthusiasm for the opportunities and seeking those comparative advantages that I talked about earlier. Now, where we've been going is we've been thinking a lot more about where the Games for Health space should go and exploring sort of what are some of the ideas in health and healthcare that we could sort of adopt and start thinking about in furthering the space. And so we sort of start with the idea of what the WHO has put out to really remind us that in a world where healthcare is predominant, that the idea of health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity, is really a great definition of health that takes us to a sense of where we can go with things that I think has a lot more bearing on what games can offer. So taking that even a step further, Dr. Martin Seligman's work and others who have been exploring this idea of positive health. Dr. Seligman was a keynote at our event a couple of years ago. What was important about what he was describing, building upon that idea, is that not only are there biological markers, psychological markers, and functional markers for what he describes as positive health, that these are all measurable. They can be defined and measured. And when you can do that, you can start talking about ways that you can instigate it through any number of interventions. And in our case, we're thinking about games. And he talks about this idea of super health, and that can we create health assets that basically give us the ability to have improved future health outcomes, which I think is very interesting because this starts to get to a higher level of descriptiveness about how you can improve someone's health irregardless of their underlying health condition. And take someone who says that they feel they're sort of normally healthy. They don't have a super expanding waistline, they haven't broken a limb, they don't seem to suffer too much from stress, and talk to them and engage them in a health conversation that goes beyond where they think they are and prepares them for the times where they may meet adversity in health and potentially allows them to heal faster and to get through that at a better ability with a higher health outcome and ideally lower cost. So we've spent time, I'm as sure as many of you have, looking at, you know, where is healthcare in this country, where is healthcare globally, and, you know, all of these sort of criticisms or changes that we see coming, I think, shouldn't be too unfamiliar to people in this room. But, you know, what we were thinking about is, you know, do we want to build games that are reactive to this analysis, or do we want to build games that are going forward and going to where we think the world's going to end up, both because of its own and because of our ability to contribute to where we think health and healthcare should go. It's sort of, as Wayne Gretzky said, I skate to where the puck is going, not to where the puck is. And so we think about games being part of a global democratized self and social care, and that providers, obviously, as they're paid for wellness, will seek out applications that drive that. And that ideally with games, our criticisms of this sort of the bad side of consumerist-based health could be really changed and turned on its head. And that games are part of the sort of technology cost curves that we think are part of the ones that drive down the cost of health technologies and care related to them, as opposed to some of the ones we've seen that drive up costs. And that ultimately, with things like DNA-based medicine, stratified medicine, there's a new health literacy that's needed, especially if we then are asking people to take on more responsibility and more parts of their self-care or the care of others. That we're going to really have to drive this at a baseline beyond where it is now, and especially when you think about it as a healthcare asset, that we're not going to suddenly turn a patient or the caregiver to a patient. The moment where somebody turns from being into a patient, where they're under care, that all of a sudden now's the point we're going to deluge them with all this information. Instead, can't we try to drive some of that ahead of time? In the health space, we're also seeing some very, very short-term, big-time trends. So sensors, this whole aspect of connected health, the quantified health, quantified self movements, and then of course I talked about positive health. And these seem to be what I would call sort of near-term trends that we can attach to that I think are part of what is going to bring us to these types of ideas. So what this means is that we ultimately want to get to people earlier. We want to generate a higher level of self-efficacy about just healthiness. We want to build health assets. We want to look at the ability for games who are already engaging people in that sort of part of their lifespan where they're likely to be sort of what I call off-grid from the healthcare space, and engage them properly and create a lifelong seductive health interface and change that model of self-health and the opportunity to use biometric games, biometric feedback, to drive a whole new opportunity for play and health. What we've seen, however, through the lifespan of Games for Health are sort of three areas of core outcome. A big area would be these sort of large sales of some of these extra games, some of the cognitive health stuff that's launched, large investment, but with what we would generally criticize as sort of a low coefficient of health impact. And again, this isn't necessarily beholden only to the Games for Health space. It's just the Games for Health, as a new kid on the block, is falling victim to similar outcomes in other areas of health innovation. Then we've had some great, wonderful stories like Remission from Hope Lab that have had a great clinical outcome, amazing success stories after their clinical trial, but for reasons of choice or other types of targeting, they're after a sort of narrow target audience. And so they represent a star in this space, but not necessarily a star at scale when we think of scale beyond a particular patient population. And then we've seen far too many bad games aimed at bad targets. We actually call them Catch the Fruit games, and when I was building this slide, I found a game literally called Catch the Fruit, where people are catching fruit and avoiding pizza, as if that is exactly a great means of changing the obesity trajectory. So it's just a lousy game with a lousy idea. Yeah, I had pizza the other day. So what we're trying to do is solve, we're interested in trying to solve the delta where there have been sales impact, but not necessarily health impact, and what kind of problems exist there, and what could we do. We also, in terms of the project, not that we don't want to see more disease state or disease population, patient population games, it's just we feel that there's an opportunity to move beyond some of those a little more aggressively. And then, of course, better games with better targets. And so where we kind of arrived at in thinking through this for about a year, about 18 months ago, was this notion of, well, where are the games everyone should play? Where are the games that are not disease-based? They have a very large-scale consumer and broad-based business opportunity and distribution model. Because many of the sort of disease state-based games or even other interventions that I've observed in the health innovation space, often get trapped by gatekeeping organizations or gatekeeping markets that are controlled by gatekeepers. That makes it hard for small entrepreneurs, many of which inhabit a space like this, to get past that kind of thing, regardless of how good their product is. And I already made an allusion that for a vast majority of things in this space, they're not that great to begin with. But I've even seen great products sort of stumble because it's just very hard to get past the sort of narrow gatekeeper model that exists in a space like healthcare. So how do you push past that? How do you deal with things that generate multiple health outcomes and address multiple health issues with a single game? And ideally could be global, move around the world, and join up with the way games have become one of the most dominant global media opportunities. And then be healthier immediately after playing, whether there's a decay rate associated with it that's quick or long. The notion is the moment you've played, even for as little as an hour or two, you are healthier for that activity. And that maybe these games could then, as a result, offer health impacts that are population-based. And then ultimately, as I said, part of this new health literacy that we feel is coming and needed. So we've looked at a variety of areas, and we've defined some of them on this slide. These are areas that we think speak to that kind of opportunity for games. And particularly what the project is now doing is we've launched an effort called Project Health Pack that's going to design thought leadership, design, storyboards, and other ideas around each of these areas. Basically, we are going to put some investment in, and already have started putting investment in, sort of de-risking the sort of visioning process as to what these things could look like, what they could be like, what kind of business models might work, and sort of take that first step, regardless of a small enterprise or a big enterprise, that kind of may hold them back, and put this all out in the public in hopes of instigating more people to build these kinds of games, or even build the kinds of support systems that might go along, that might level up one of these particular areas where the games in that space already, or the activity already underway, maybe solve some of that delta of activity to health impact that we were criticizing earlier. As a population health effect, the idea is that if these games are broadly targeted, somebody who plays one particular game may also be able to then not only be healthier for themselves, but healthier for other people around them. You play a great cooking game, you're not only cooking better for yourself, you're cooking better for anybody who's going to be consuming that next meal that you prepare. You're exercising, perhaps this is a social exercise game, so you're drawing in friends and family as a result of that. So part of our underlying goal is to really explore a public health model that matches up well with games, and really driving that. Now, we're at the mHealth conference, so I just wanted to talk about a little bit how we think some of the mobile space has a unique opportunity to play, because you can think of mobile as being just a computing platform upon which you can run any kind of application, but there are special affordances that mobility gives us, and I think that's worth discussing throughout the afternoon. What are those real comparative advantages that exist within mobile? So just thinking about, like we talked about exercise being a target, walking is probably the most ubiquitous form of exercise that we can undertake on a population basis. There's a very small amount of the population that can't walk some amount of time in distance. And so we're looking at how mobile walking games could be a big part of that. Biking, running, these are things that you wouldn't normally do at a desktop computer. Nutrition's a great example because there are a lot of great nutrition apps, but they're apps or games that you could play sitting right in your living room. Yet a large number of healthcare decisions as it relates to nutrition are at the point of purchase, where you were sitting in the store and trying to decide what were you going to buy to bring home for dinner for the next 5 days. So we could potentially build applications that are being played inside supermarkets. Kids and otherwise families could play and be part of, and expand this and use the pervasive opportunities, location-based games, things like that. Stress isn't something that follows us, that stays at home and doesn't follow us out the door. So again, we have opportunities to look at how mobility allows us to address these types of things and create new types of games around that. So in our booth and some of the things that weren't able to make it, there's actually a fairly rich ecosystem of interesting things that are being done in the mobile health space, mobile games for health space. And these are, there are more and more coming, and the spectrum of things that people are doing from first aid to exploring board games about inoculation to anti-smoking, glucose monitoring, and so forth, provide an opportunity or provide an illustration of very interesting, innovative work. We just want to see more of it, and we want to see it achieve a higher level of success. Let me just finish by saying a couple of other things. This is just a note that I developed this week, which is only a few years ago, operating in this space, this was the dominant sort of intersection point that we were thinking about. Games that run on desktop computers or computer game consoles, most often at home, perhaps at work, and this is what we saw the vast majority of people developing for. In fact, we still see a lot of development in this space. Now, what we've seen, though, in the last few years is this notion of gamification, a sort of lightweight kind of application of game elements like score and challenges, short narratives, snippets of story, and then, of course, the rise of mobile. So, we've gone from sort of a one spot of activity to now a growing spectrum of activity that we can look at, and trying to understand what, where you place down on that. And if I put up, I could make this far more complex and put up social games and other things. It's becoming a wide set of patterns in engineering and platforms that we can target, and try to understand how we use that is becoming something that we're all starting to learn from. And it's growing the space as well as growing the number of decisions and choices that we have to make. So you could just see that spectrum, though. We see apps on one end. We see sort of gamification or gamified apps kind of moving a little bit to the right of that. And then, of course, we have full-fledged games. And, I don't want to necessarily tell you where you should land on this spectrum as much as to just say there's a real, you should identify with the fact that there's a spectrum of things. And one of the only criticisms that I'll give is that sometimes I see organizations saying, "Oh, we're doing we're doing games because we're doing a sort of gamified nutrition app, with a little bit of bells and whistles added onto that," and they feel like the whole box is checked. And I defy you to think that if you're doing that you're doing anything that's on that you're doing anything but maybe one or two things on that slide or on the slide before. There's a rich opportunity here, but it's going to require the kind of investment of time and energy and knowledge development that ultimately unlocks what I think will be some of those comparative advantages that we've seen in the work so far and that we're going to see continuing going forward. So that gives you a sense of perspective, I hope, a little bit of landscape. I'm going to let Ellen LaPointe from Hope Lab come up, and she's going to talk about some of their work, which I think gives you another sort of viewpoint into where things are and where they're going. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ellen LaPointe. I am the Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Hope Lab, and I am going to take just a little bit of time. I have sort of deliberately curtailed this presentation to be brief so that we can really maximize opportunities for interaction. What I'll do right now is I think we're here because I think we represent a case study in the space, and I'll explain to you two major initiatives that Hope Lab has undertaken over the last 11 years of our existence. I'm curious if you could just raise your hand if you've ever attended a presentation at which Hope Lab was discussed. Don't be afraid. Throw them right up in the air. Okay, great. So most of you are new to us. That's fabulous. So let me start at the beginning. Hope Lab is a nonprofit organization. We're based in Redwood City, California, and we are basically in the business of harnessing the power and appeal of technology to improve kids' health. So what does that mean? It means long ago, our founder and board chair, Pam Omidyar, who is the wife of the eBay founder, Pierre Omidyar, actually recognized, this was in the mid-90s, the potential in video games in particular at that point to have a positive effect on kids and then specifically to actually influence their health behavior. She had a particular idea around this video game remission that I'll talk about, and the longer story is that at that point in her life had absolutely no success. She even pitched the idea that she had, which was to basically give kids a chance to blast away at their cancer in the context of a video game, pitched it to the industry, absolutely no uptake at that point. She herself was relatively unknown, and then lo and behold, eBay was created. And she woke up with the capacity to do this. And that is why Hope Lab was born, was in order to see that vision through. And to her eternal credit, at the very outset, she made a commitment that the organization would approach its work in this fashion all the time. And that is to combine rigorous research, both formative and outcomes research, and I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about our research today, with these innovative solutions. In that case, initially, it was the use of a video game to change health behaviors in kids, which was kind of radical 15, 20 years ago. And then really involving kids themselves directly in the development effort. So Hope Lab's whole approach is super iterative. We engage our target audience, our customer, throughout the development process to inform what we're doing. We basically believe that if you lead with fun, the health will follow. And if you don't lead with fun, there's no point in continuing, because it really is not going to work as a game for a kid in particular unless it speaks to them. So we involve kids throughout the effort. We have, in our history, I'm actually going to take these in reverse order on purpose, developed a product called Zamzi, and I'm not going to spend much time on it because my colleague Dan Botwinick is going to talk about it at length in the very next session, so I'm going to let him spend most of his time on that. But what I'll tell you is that Hope Lab developed this product in partnership with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in order to address the alarming problem of sedentary behavior in middle school age kids. We were very, very compelled by that issue and the fact that we know that physical activity is good for you regardless of weight or weight loss. And so we set about trying to come up with a product that would be effective at motivating kids to be more physically active. And Zamzi was the result of that effort. And what it is in a nutshell is it's a game, it's an online experience that kids engage in that is driven by real-world physical activity. It consists of a 3-axis accelerometer that kids wear around, and that gives them essentially points for their movement. They then plug that device into a computer and go onto the Zamzi.com website, where all of that activity is converted into a currency that they can use in multiple ways to obtain all kinds of different rewards and engage with their friends socially through the product experience. And again, Dan will go into this in some depth, so I will just pause there with that brief overview. Consistent with Hope Lab's commitment, once we had developed this prototype, and that took a long time because we had this iterative process I described as both expensive and time-consuming, we then subjected it to a large-scale clinical trial. Randomized controlled studies are the approach that we take to determining impact. And in this case, we actually did a series of pilot studies, 11 altogether, leading up to a large-scale RCT, to try to get a sense as to whether we had succeeded in this objective that we had, which was to increase MVPA rates in kids over a 6-month period of time. That 6-month number that we selected really has public health roots. We're looking for sort of ignition in these kids. We're trying to create motivators to engage them over a persistent and significant amount of time, such that you increase the likelihood that the motivations will shift to be more intrinsic and thus sustain themselves. In the public health setting, a 6-month intervention of efficacy is a pretty good outcome. So that's why we chose that. We were also interested in biomarkers. I mean, one of the kind of things that we've been able to do, given our perspective and position at Hope Lab, is to really look at the biology that is impacted in the context of video games and gameplay, and actually devoting resources in our research to making those connections and assessments. So I will talk to you a bit about that. In this study, which enrolled about 450 kids, it was in 6 school-based sites around the country, a range of sort of rural, suburban, and urban kids, breadth of SES and gender and race and ethnicity. It was just a broad-based, school-based study. We studied 6, again, it was a 6-month intervention, and half the kids were randomized. All the kids received this accelerometer and were asked to wear it the whole time. And then only half of those kids were given access to the website experience. So that was the basic study design, pretty straightforward. About half of the kids in the study consented additionally to having a blood draw done so we could do some biomarker work, and I'll walk you through some of our findings there as well. And this is what we found. This stuff works. You create a fun experience for a kid that's engaging and motivating, and and they will engage in positive health behaviors. You do not have to hit them over the head with it. They will do it. So will we, adults. In our case with this study, we saw 59% increases in the intervention group relative to the control group over time. And as you see, just to give you a sense of what that is, that's about like doing 45 minutes worth of nonstop push-ups. That's about it's like scrubbing floors for 3 hours in a month. It's like chasing wild pigs for 6 minutes a day. There's somebody on my staff who figured that out. One quick anecdote: we hear from kids all the time that, in fact, we may think about exercise as push-ups and running, but for a lot of kids, the opportunities for movement in their lives look a lot more like the other two, where they're really trying to integrate movement into a life that may or may not have resources attached to it, such that they have access to teams or sports or safe streets. They may be in their house. They may have kids, brothers and sisters that they have to watch over. They may have lots of responsibilities. And we were actually very interested in those kids in particular because they tend to be at higher risk for being sedentary over time. So these are sort of cute, but they're also actually relevant. The other thing I would point out on this slide is the CDC recommends 60 minutes of MVPA in this age group, 60 minutes per day, and we are not seeing that. I want to be clear. This is not, and you look at both the control and the intervention group, that is a very, very high goal. And I say that not because I make no comment as to whether that should be the goal, but I just want to observe for you that this is not something that's happening very easily in the lives of our kids. So it's really a problem that we need to be thinking about. The impact that we saw persisted for the 6-month period of time. So, of course, that was something we were interested in. This really speaks to whether the experience itself was sufficiently engaging in different ways. Dan will walk you through the site experience a lot, and he can show you kind of how those things have been built in. One thing I will say to you is the 11 pilot studies that we conducted at Hope Lab in order to kind of understand our impact really were done in order to inform product development. So there are many components of this site that reflect our research findings in controlled randomized settings that showed us that various elements of the experience are independently motivating and significantly so to either get kids active or keep them there. We also took a look at a couple of key subgroups. Girls are more at risk for becoming sedentary in this sort of younger, by the way, the age group is roughly 8 to 14. The sweet spot for this product really, we believe, is in the 8 to 12 year range. Girls are more at risk for becoming sedentary. And in this study that we did, we saw 103% increases in the girls in the intervention condition versus the control condition. So that was a terrific finding. And then similarly, let me back up. Did I miss one? Yes, the other one. Kids with a BMI of greater than 25, those are kids who are considered overweight. We similarly saw a significant finding here, 27% increases relative to the kids who were in the control group. Statistically significant finding. One thing I would emphasize here again, this was not a BMI study or a weight loss study. That is not what this product was designed to achieve. Certainly it would be a tool that one could use in a comprehensive program where you're working on weight loss with kids, but in and of itself it was not designed to achieve that in its own right. We had some nice findings in the biomarkers. We looked at the LDL levels in the kids in the control and the intervention conditions and saw better results, significantly better results among the kids in the intervention group. One thing I would point out here is that these are normal ranges. The kids in the study overall were tested within the normal range for LDL levels. You would expect that in a school-based study. This was not a group of kids we chose who have metabolic syndrome or diabetes. We're looking at trending here. We're really trying to get a sense of this as a harbinger for whether you can have an impact on biology with games. So this is how I would encourage you to interpret a finding like this. And similarly with blood sugar levels, which were associated with hypertension and diabetes, we had positive findings in terms of significant findings, again, relative to the intervention group relative to the control group. So just a little bit more, and I would offer here that this what I'm going to talk about is specific to Zanzi, but is something that we're all wanting to be thinking about when we consider games as a means to achieve impact in behavior change. Really the question is sort of what's going on and how do we harness this experience? How do we really take this experience as a means to motivate behavior and keep it going? And we really, at Hope Lab, believe that this is what's going on is a combination of both an intrinsic and extrinsic experience. Most of us need some extrinsic motivators to do things. I don't ever leave the house for a run without my iPhone for my music. It just doesn't happen. I'll go back and get it if I forget it. But I'm intrinsically motivated to run because it's good for my body, and I feel so much better when I'm doing it over time. But if I'm not doing it over time, the first time I go back out, it's always really hard. So it's this. I'm just using myself as a personal example of the sort of inherent tension in all of us around this notion of motivation. So in the case of Zamzi, and this is literature-based, and Dan's going to show you how this actually plays out in the site, but you're really looking at creating intrinsic motivations to get kids moving, and then using the intrinsic sort of rewards that are built into the site and the experience to kind of keep them coming back, if you will. And fundamentally, if we look at these are the 5 sort of key components of intrinsic motivation. This is not Hope Lab's research. This is sort of field findings. You really find people engaging more if they are able to gain a sense of competence over what they're doing, if they feel capable and effective. People like autonomy, of course, freedom and control, very much the case in this age group. We've heard that sharply with the kids we talked with, because that's the thing they're really striving for at that tween and young teenage. They want a sense of mastery. You want to have a feeling like you're getting better at something and conquering it ultimately. You want to have a purpose, a goal. And you want the capacity to relate to others socially, connection, basically. And so Zamzi has achieved this in that combination of things that Dan will walk you through. And so we have these findings that I think are quite lovely. We're delighted with them. Dan works for a social enterprise Hope Lab created with the express purpose of scaling this product. We could do a whole 2-hour talk on scale and how we are trying to approach this challenge and opportunity in the field. Maybe we can, if there are any of you in the room who have questions about that specifically, we could take it up after I finish. So the other piece of this I would speak to is the remission game. This was the first game that Hope Lab developed. It was a PC-based game, 20 missions, fully rendered video game, rated by the ESRB, in which the players had to pilot an antibiotic roxy through the bodies of fictitious cancer patients. And in order to win the game, you had to get those patients to do the things they had to do in real life to beat their cancer. So they had to take their chemotherapy, they had to do their radiation, report side effects and symptoms and the like. Treatment adherence is a very big problem in teens and young adults undergoing cancer treatment. And for reasons that make sense, these drugs make them sick, they make them stand out, they make them miss things. It's sort of the worst possible time to have to go through that. And a lot of the treatments for leukemias and lymphomas in this age group are oral maintenance therapies that they have to take themselves over 2 years. So it's on these kids to take their pills. It's the one age group in which survivor rates are not on the rise in cancer in the U.S. And it's attributed in part, at least, to this problem of adherence. So this game is really designed to support adherence and to do so by really enhancing the sense of self-efficacy in young people, a sense of their power and control, their ability to rise to a challenge, in this case, cancer. Once the game was developed, which in and of itself could be another 2-hour talk, we put it into a large-scale RCT. In this case, 375 kids, 34 hospitals, 3 countries, and took a look at these outcomes we were most concerned about. And we had significant findings across the board. The kids who played remission took their treatments more consistently, and we measured those objectively using, we measured chemotherapy metabolites in the blood, and we also used MEMS caps. Some of you may know what those are. It's a surrogate marker for compliance with pill taking. It's like a chip embedded in a pill cap that's considered to be a decent clinical marker for compliance in the study. The kids had significantly higher cancer knowledge, which you would expect, and then they had significantly higher self-efficacy. And what I would say to you is the kind of the lead in any story that came out about the game when it did was really this first finding, this treatment adherence finding, because it's objective evidence that a game can be used to change behavior, and that's fabulous. We believe the salient finding is the self-efficacy finding, that we have been able to demonstrate that through a gameplay experience you can change someone's relationship to their disease and their own sense of their ability to do something about it. So that to us really is the driver in terms of our work that we're doing and thinking about how to go forward and be meaningfully, have a meaningful impact. These findings were published in Pediatrics Medical Journal in 2008, which matters because it legitimized this whole idea of games as a means to affect change and change outcomes in the healthcare setting. So for a lot of physicians, it was the reason that the game was that they were willing to make a game available to their patients, and that's turned out to be really key. We distribute this game free and worldwide. There's about 200,000 copies out to date. And as Ben mentioned, you have something on the order of about 25,000 new cancer diagnoses in this age group every year in the U.S. So it's a pretty decent penetration, if you will, of this relatively small market, which is great. The Zamsi conversation is an entirely different one because you're talking about reaching potentially millions. So we are working on the next version of this game. That original was released in 2006, and we are actually now at a place where we have created Remission 2, and it's changed completely, and that is in part due to how the game space has changed, and it's also because we've learned a great deal about what was and was not effective in the original version. So it's now a suite of mini games that kids can basically go onto a web platform and play. It's a streaming experience. It's not downloadable. You don't have to get a copy. It's just something you can access if you have internet access, basically. And we did that in a way that, in order to, first of all, allow people to sort of go on and off quickly, which we know is how gameplay has evolved over the last 7 or 8 years. Also because it allowed us to introduce different types of gameplay experience. The original game was a shooter game, which is great, but some kids don't really like that. So we created these games have some variety in the sort of the whole structure of gameplay. And it incorporates all the things we've learned to date about what, really we believe is the underpinnings of the efficacy of the original game. This is, again, all based on research we did. We did some fMRI studies watching people play the game in a machine and seeing what happened in their brain. We've done subsequent studies to try to understand this. And really what we believe is this all comes down to combining knowledge with motivation. And our finding in the brain study, which I'm not going to show you, is really important, which is that it's the actual gameplay itself that's key. So you can watch a video of someone playing a video game. Okay, you can watch that, and if the only difference between, if Ben is playing and I'm watching him play, and the only difference is that Ben's playing, Ben's brain is going to be lit up completely differently from mine, and it's the motivational and reward centers of the brain in his body that are going to be activated. And, well, that's another talk. I'm throwing as much as I can in it really fast, but this is coming out early next year, probably early in the second quarter. We're very excited about it, and stay tuned. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So we have. Yeah.
I have a hard stop at 2:30. I have to get on an airplane, so I have 15 minutes.
We have some time to take some questions, specifically in terms of what we also had put on for this was just talking also generally about the landscape and investment opportunity. So what I was trying to present to you, I think spoke to that a little bit in terms of it gave you a sense of where things have been and where we think they're going. And in terms of an investment opportunity, I do believe not only are we putting our own funds that Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has given us for the Games for Health project into those areas that I talked about and that strategy I talked about. But I do believe that that's a larger scale opportunity for anybody who's involved in this space in terms of looking at where games and health can come together. I think Ellen also, in terms of looking where Hope Lab has invested in terms of their original work with Remission, but their considerable work with Zamsi, which is rolling out now, again, speaks to a similar sort of trajectory that I outlined, and I think that is an underlying opportunity. Let me just speak of a few other small things that I've seen happen in this space that I think are very interesting. So one particular area is this area of neurotherapeutics, games that are, you can think of them as cognitive brain training, but I think beyond some of the early brain training stuff that we've seen with groups like Lumosity and others, there's a whole new wave of these coming, including there's one particular one that's being backed by PureTech Ventures out of Boston called Achille Interactive Labs, which is partially started by Adam Gazzaley at University of California, San Francisco. And they've done some really, really interesting work on using games and an algorithm behind them to work to cut down on people's distraction through interference within an environment, thus allowing them to focus more. Very, very interesting work that started with grants, started with internal work at the lab, gained traction with grants from the Health Games research portfolio that Robert Wood Johnson launched a few years ago in conjunction through the University of California, Santa Barbara, and then moved through to an investment opportunity and is going to be coming to market as they start to mature that into a marketable product. And what was very interesting there is just a simple takeaway that I'm amazed about is when PureTech looks and other VC have looked at this space and looked at the cost of development in this space as well as keeping it going while they kind of figure out where it may best land. It's fraction compared to the cost of other medical device or pharma investments to get them to similar stages. So that's a very, very interesting opportunity about the direct therapeutic efforts here and how they compare from an investment opportunity in other areas. There's a conference called ESCONS, E-S-C-O-N-S, that will be hosting in March in Los Angeles that was started by people working in the intersection of neuroscience, neurotherapeutics, and games. That is, I think, going to be quite a seminal event this year in terms of seeing the space emerge. Ayogo, who is in our booth, has really focused on social-based games for health, as well as social mobile. They have gone, I've known them for about 3 years, they've gone from about 3 people sort of feeling their way through the space up to 35 people with revenues of $2 million. And they're growing quite quickly and along the lines of some of these new game design patterns, new areas where there's broad engagement opportunities. Zamzi, of course, Super Better, founded by Jane McGonigal, and then I think all of these sensor hardware spaces where there's opportunity to combine games with a particular type of sensor and package that are all great areas of not only some level of the active undertaking, but just grand opportunity to meet these large markets. And I think Zamzi is probably really one of the first big ones to get out in that way. There's a couple of others, GeoPals and some others that are also experimenting in this space at different demographic levels as well. So happy to take questions.
Any questions?
First, I would like to congratulate Zamzi for the fabulous, impressive design of the game and the convincing clinical trial results. My name is Simon Lin. I'm from Marshfield Clinic. The core competency of our organization is to rapidly conduct clinical trials at a very low cost. My question to Zamzi is, in your clinical study, how quick you were able to recruit the patients? That's a follow-up comments by Francis Collins on his comments of the technology moving so fast. After we get the clinical trial finished, the technology many times it's already fading away.
Sure. I'm going to repeat your question just to make sure I understand it. So you've asked how quickly we were able to recruit for the study, and you made the comment that one of the challenges in technology is getting that research done in a timely fashion so the technology doesn't pass you by. Is that it? The study actually accrued extremely quickly. We went into schools and invited them to participate in this project and had enrollment essentially occur on the spot. I've been in clinical research in my own career over a long time in drug research, and it's really quite a different animal to bring a game-based experience into a school and ask who wants to play than it is to bring a drug into a clinic and ask who's willing to take the risk. And so I would just offer that as a distinguishing factor in this experience. With the remission game, the recruitment similarly was rapid and well within our timeframes. The only distinguisher there was we had a few more eligibility criteria to take into account. The kids had to have they had to be in treatment over a certain period of time. They had to be expected to live for the duration of the study. There was that kind of thing. And again, because you don't have a large background prevalence, that just took longer for that reason. But I would say this is just a overarching learning at Hope Lab. you know, it all comes down to site selection and making sure that you have people already in the organization, in particular with games, who are on board with the concept. If you have someone who's skeptical who's driving this inside, you know, or is responsible for it, obviously it's going to be a different experience than if you have someone who's really enthusiastic about exploring this as you are. The other thing I would offer, which we learned, and in fact which paid off very well in the ZAMZ experience, is we actually did not select a site for impact trial participation unless they had successfully completed a pilot with us. So part of our pilot strategy was to suss out sites and figure out who was going to have the capacity to deliver quality data and this kind of thing. So that was something I think that we will continue in the future. I think it was a very successful strategy. Are these mics actually working? I have no sense of them. Okay, great.
Thank you. I'm Alan Goodwin, vConnect Mobile. 25 years ago, we developed a board game called Alcohol, Drugs, Play It Straight. Sort of our notion was that every family would play this game and drugs would be a non-issue for young people. And obviously, it didn't work. The interesting lesson, and I'd be interested in your comments, was that when we raced into New York to the toy and game meetings, and everybody just looked at it and said, nobody's going to buy this. Yeah. People, families, parents will not really look at a serious issue in terms of games. You're working with a very clinical population rather than necessarily a wellness, maybe even a disease management population where you're asking people in the general community. It sounds like you're approaching people in a clinical setting. But your obesity product obviously has a bigger scope. How are you going to get people to jump in
Sure.
who don't really want to deal with this stuff?
Great question. And I think it's the question for the field is what I would offer. And I think our our experiences in both remission and ZAMZ can be informative. As you point out with remission, there's two things about that. It's a targeted population, and it's free. So that's a key thing. Our strategy in distribution with that product has been exclusively focused on sustaining relationships with hospitals, and in particular with the people inside the hospitals whose job it is to put resources into the hands of families. And that actually is an ongoing effort that is required in order to keep this game present of mind in those settings. As you, I'm sure, appreciate, in clinical settings, even though everybody's hungry for resources, they're also inundated with challenges to their time and offer opportunities for, you know, people. A lot of people want to put things in the hands of those families, and so they have to be very thoughtful about how that happens. So Hope Lab has continued to invest time and resources into making that happen. We do a lot of work in clinical conferences with pediatric oncology nurses and social workers and child life specialists. And that strategy has, I think, by and large been effective, and I think it's one that we would replicate when we're focused on a narrow audience like that. But what I would tell you there is another key learning is, I think from the outset, one of the, I think, again, I give her all the credit, one of Pam's really sort of key and smart insights was we did not see this game as competing with a cancer pamphlet. We saw it as competing with another video game that a kid would want to play. So it really had to be built as something that they'd want to spend leisure time doing, not just a means to, you know, like, oh, here you're in the clinic and we have to give you some bad news, and so here, have this. So that was the reason that all the investment occurred in the product as it was ultimately built, so that it could compete with whatever Indiana Jones title might have been also there at their house or even in the clinic that day. From the ZAMZ side, the whole of the scaling question is actually it's a completely different animal, and one that is ongoing. What I would offer there in terms of sort of insights to date is you've got sort of a dual challenge, because in the one sense, your core customer is your user. This product has got to appeal to those kids. They have to want to come back and do what sort of we're trying to get them to do in order for this to be an effective intervention, and in order for it to work for them. But they're not going to buy it, right? They're not the buyer. So you've got a payer as a totally different audience. And so and a lot of the work that we're doing in the social enterprise space, and Dan can speak to this at length, is really trying to understand where we're going to gain the most traction. As a very early startup, I want to be clear, this product is just newly available. Those findings were announced in September. So as we move out into the space, looking at what you would think of as a traditional sort of retail stream, but what we're thinking is more likely to be the effective approach is really to partner with institutions and others who are also interested in the wellness space. Clinical settings, absolutely, primary care settings, but also potentially employee wellness programs, schools and after-school programs. We've certainly secured some philanthropic support over the last few years to distribute in lower-income communities, which is great, but I haven't met a single school that can buy this because nobody has the money. So that's an ongoing...
Interesting, our market became schools.
Yeah.
I think also, I mean, we're a long way from board games with this now. I mean, and board games require a lot of logistics to play. I mean, the world's evolved, and I think the opportunity is to create new types of play experiences that have that ability to appeal across the spectrum. Right? I think in some cases you could try to appeal with other video games, or ideally you're appealing with an experience that is interesting in and of itself, and that is facilitating that, and ideally uses the computing platform to take away some of the logistical hurdles that may have existed in prior opportunities. I think that we're just at the beginning of this, and you know, there'll be lots of experimentation, but we've got a whole new set of advantages that we can look at that I just don't think were available when you tried what you were trying.
Can I ask, I have time for one more question, and if it's, I would ask that it not be ZAMZ related, because I believe Dan can take those on, if there's one more for me.
The question I have is that the research that you're seeing in gaming and how much there's engagement using games, improving outcomes, how does it compare to traditional approaches that healthcare providers do to improve outcomes? Because, you know, 60% improvement in an outcome is typical that you see if you go to a clinical conference and they talk about, we did this program to, you know, provide more knowledge or provide more engagement to our patients, shows same 60%. So is any competitive effectiveness research on this showing how much this improves more than what traditional providers do to engage with consumers?
The research that we have done is what I have shown you, and that is related to sort of the intervention versus no intervention. We did some early pilot work where we compared ZAMZ to an earlier version of ZAMZ to another product that's a commercial product made by Konami called DDR, Dance Dance Revolution, to see if it, and that was actually a proof of concept study because we were interested in whether it would hold up at all. And we actually saw significantly better results even relative to that product. But in answer to your question, I would, my own sense personally, having been in this space now for about 8 years, is that is the next threshold. That's the next frontier. Nobody's gotten that far yet. I mean, just the fact that we are able to prove biological effects with a game is a good start. Doing what you might think of as, multi-drug studies, which is essentially what you're talking about, would be sort of the next frontier, I would suggest.
Yeah, I would agree with that, as well as to just say I think that there's still a lot of opportunities to build things that have other advantages besides just results. So advantages at cost, advantages at lower cost to implement, different populations. We've seen some things where games have reached unique populations of patients that were not making it through to other types of interventions around exercise. So we've seen little bits and pieces of comparative advantage, but the kind of comparative advantage research that you're talking about, I think is a matter of time and investment and getting through. I think we still need a decent amount of still the kinds of studies like what Ellen was showing, to further establish what's the sort of baseline by itself intervention. Getting into comparative, not only comparative against other kinds of interventions as you described, but even just comparative media, discussions as well. Despite that, I think advantages, there are some advantages that can be seen as self-evident.
What I would say is just the fact of your question is fabulous, because you're saying, oh, yeah, sure, just like everything else. Well, just that proven point, that you take that as a given is an enormous breakthrough in this field. So thank you. My email address is elapointe@hopelab.org. If any of you would like to follow up, I'm very sorry I have to go, but I have to get to the airport. So thank you all so much.
So that was a good turn. We have additional sessions. We'll take a small break. I'm happy to answer questions and hear about your work as well. If you'd like to stay with us, we've got some other great content and knowledge to share. Thank you. So long. Safe flight.